guys, so today I'm going to be talking about color and how I choose colors to give my illustrations a distinct and cohesive aesthetic. Of course, your color preferences are personal to you, but I think there are definitely ways to make your color picking more intentional and less random, whether you use bold, vibrant colors or muted pastel colors. So the first part of this video is going to be a little bit about color in general, and the second part is going to be about how I choose colors for my own artwork and little tricks I have picked up along the way. So let's begin with a little bit about basic color theory. The main terms that you should know about are hue, saturation, and value, otherwise known as brightness. Hue refers to the main characteristic of the color that we see and is basically just the name that you would use to describe the color. So is it purple, is it blue, is it green? You get the gist. Different hues have different psychological ties, and this can really drive the emotion of the scene. So for instance, red is associated with danger and passion, and blue is associated with calmness and trust, but I'm sure you're already familiar with most of these. So when you're choosing your colors, you can use these traits to elicit a specific response from the viewer. So now let's touch on saturation. Saturation refers to how pure or grayed down a color is. So more saturated colors are usually bright and vibrant, whereas desaturated colors are usually dulled down and a little bit grayer. And finally, value refers to the lightness or darkness of a color. Value determines the contrast in your drawings, and it can also be used to strategically make certain elements of your composition stand out. In most cases, when you're building a composition, you want the contrast to be balanced. You can actually check your values by making your drawing black and white, and this should reveal whether or not there is enough contrast in your illustration, and if there are certain areas where the values need tweaking. A mistake that I made when I first started making art was by being afraid to use more saturated and brighter colors. I was often adding a lot of darkness to the colors in my early work, and it gave it a very muddy appearance. Adding a bit more saturation and brightness can really make your work more crisp and visually appealing. Knowing about these concepts is helpful for when you are building a color palette. So two common types of color palettes that you'll often see in artwork are complementary and analogous color palettes. First, let's talk about complementary color palettes. Complementary color palettes use colors that are opposite from one another in the color wheel. For example, you have blue and orange, and you also have green and red. These colors complement each other quite nicely and can make different elements of your composition pop by creating an interesting color contrast. So here are a couple of examples of how I use complementary color schemes in my work. So in this first one, you can see that I am using orange and blue, and in the second one, you can see that I am using green and red. Complementary colors can be quite overpowering, so you might be able to see that in my work I use one color as the main color throughout the piece and the other color as an accent color. So now let's talk about analogous color palettes. Analogous color palettes use colors that lie next to each other in the color palette instead of across from one another. These colors will usually share quite a few similarities, and they're often used to create scenes that are very comfortable to the eye. When you're using an analogous color palette, you will often use value to create contrast, because you're not using like a range of different colors to create that color contrast that we talked about earlier. So here are a couple of examples of how I've used analogous color palettes in my work, and you can see on this one I am using different colors and different shades of blue, and in this one I am using different shades of green. One technique I use to simplify my color selecting process is by keeping a limited color palette. Limiting the number of colors that you use in your work eliminates chaos and also makes your work look more confident and well thought out. I try to stick to 2 to 3 different hues, not including the skin or the hair color of a character. Now that we've covered the basics of color palettes, let's talk about color preferences and how to find your favorite colors. I think everybody already has a general idea of the colors that they tend to gravitate towards. You can usually tell what's aesthetically pleasing to you by looking at things like your fashion sense, your interior, and even your favorite artists. But if you are feeling a little bit stuck about which colors you want to include in your illustration, or maybe you're bored of using the same colors and want to spice things up, a great place to start is with Pinterest. At the beginning, when I was trying to figure out which colors I wanted to include in my illustrations, I created a Pinterest board called Color Inspiration, and here I pinned basically anything that I like the color of. That could be art, interior, fashion, I mean literally anything as long as it was aesthetically pleasing to me. So I added all of these images into my board, and when my Pinterest board had more than 15 to 20 images inside, I zoomed out so that I could see all of the pins together at a glance, and I took a screenshot. From here, I imported this screenshot into Procreate and used the color picker tool to select some of my favorite colors from this board and created a new color palette. As time's gone on, I have refined this color palette with a lot of trial and error, and I've discovered which colors I enjoy using the most in my work. Personally, I like to use a lot of warm colors over cool colors. You'll see a lot of pinks and oranges in my work because that is just what I gravitate towards. When I'm creating my warm toned color palettes, I'm often thinking about how I can manipulate colors to make everything more cohesive. So if I wanted to bring in like a blue or a green to a pink or a peach dominated drawing, I could do this and keep it on theme and easy on the eyes. So these are a few tricks that I have learned to make my color palettes more cohesive, and I think this works regardless of whether you're using cool or warm tone colors. Firstly, when you're choosing your palette, you can blend your colors either with the background or the skin color to give them a similar base hue. Say I have a pink background and I want to add green plants to my illustration. To make this green color work well with the background, I can add the green on top of the pink and either use a blending brush to mix these two colors together, or I can simply lower the opacity of the green layer. You can then use the color picker tool, and this should create a new green that is a little bit more cohesive or more fitting with the background or the skin color. Another way you can make your color palette more cohesive is by creating a low opacity overlay layer on top of your chosen colors. For example, if I want all of the colors to have a warm undertone, I can create a new layer on top of everything, set it to an overlay blend mode, and fill the entire canvas with an orange color. I can then decrease the opacity, and you'll see that all the colors within the illustrations begin to take on a warmer appearance. You can do the same thing with a blue color, so you could fill the whole canvas with blue, and as you can imagine, it would make the colors take on a cooler appearance. And finally, the last trick that I use comes at the end of my illustration process, and that is by adjusting the curves. First, you want to make sure that everything is on one layer, and then in Procreate, you can go to the Adjustments menu and select Curves. This tool allows you to make different color adjustments by pulling the reds, blues, and greens up and down depending on the look you want to achieve. For my work, I usually pull up the red midtones to increase the overall warmth of an illustration, but you can just play around with it and see what you like. Before I finish up, I just want to briefly touch on how I approach choosing colors when I'm creating a new drawing and like where that fits into my illustration workflow. So I usually do it in a few steps. So I typically choose a color palette when I have completed the line art of my illustration. I may already have like a rough idea of the colors that I want to use before I start, but this is when I do the real like experimenting and refining. Throughout this process, I'm always keeping in mind the contrast and the emotion of what I'm trying to convey in the illustration. I start by setting a background color, and I very roughly block out all the major shapes with a large brush. I try to keep them all on different layers so that they can be altered easily. So I usually select the colors in this order. I start with the background, and then I do the skin and the hair color. Then it's clothing and accessories, and finally it's the background elements. It's important to choose the background color first because this should be the foundation of your palette. I test out a few different color palette options. I copy all the layers and minimize them to create these little color thumbnails so that I can see them all side by side and compare them. I keep adjusting the thumbnails until I land on a color palette that I really like, and then I use this thumbnail for reference while I am coloring my drawing. Okay, so that was a lot of information in one go, but I really hope that you enjoyed this video. This was my first proper tutorial, so I would love to hear any feedback that you might have. And if you want to see more videos like this in the future, just comment down below what you would like me to talk about. Alright, well, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great week, and I will see you next time. Bye!